Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday, April something or other, April 14th. Look at that. We're going to be talking about pedigrees today, which you should have watched a video yesterday kind of introducing it to you. This is the next step in Punnett squares, more or less. So a Punnett square gives us ratios for if you cross two particular parents. A pedigree takes it kind of the next step and shows, well, if those parents have these offspring and these offspring meet these people and reproduce, what is it going to look like after years and years and years? So a pedigree, more or less a family tree that also has some genetic information on it. So came about in about 1932. The whole purpose of a pedigree is to not have to do 500 Punnett squares if you want to know what are the odds that somebody 2 generations from now will have a particular trait. So instead of doing Punnett square after Punnett square, now you're going to be looking at a very easy graphic to read. So that's the whole point. It just makes it a little bit cleaner instead of having to do all that Punnett square work. Okay, so what's the purpose of a pedigree? It allows us to track the history of a particular trait through multiple generations. I want you to think of it like a family tree. Let's see if I can get myself out of the way here. But with genetic information included as well. So you got a family tree, you're going to recognize the shape of a pedigree, but it just has some different rules than a regular family tree. So speaking of rules, the two main ones that you have to remember, and there's really no easy way to remember this, is on a pedigree, males are always going to be squares and females are always going to be circles. So in your notes, I believe you have a symbols and rules section. Males are going to be squares, females are going to be circles, and that never changes. No matter what pedigree you're looking at, that rule will always be the same. Okay. So get some more symbols. So you've got horizontal lines. If you've got a line going across, like this one. Oh, I'm moving the line instead of drawing on it. Whoops. If you've got a line like that, that is showing you that those two individuals are reproducing. So that connects mom to dad. So if you ever see horizontal lines right here, that indicates that these two people are going to create an offspring. Okay. And then your vertical line here, that is going to show this offspring down here came from these two parents up here. Okay. So vertical lines show here's where this particular offspring came from. Okay. So in your notes here, you want to label mom, dad, and daughter. Remember, males are square, females are circles. And so obviously this is going to be dad, this will be mom, and then that's going to be daughter. Okay. Now it'll branch out a little bit more than this. It gets a way more complicated, I guess, than just 3 shapes, but we'll keep going here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. A couple other really important things with symbols. Okay. Now remember, a pedigree is all about tracking traits. So we need to know if a person has the track trait, or we need to know if they're a carrier of it. So I'll talk about the difference in a second. So if you see a solid square or circle, if it's completely shaded in, that tells you that that person, the square or the circle, has that trait, whatever trait you're interested in. It could be brown eyes. It could be cystic fibrosis, like your practice yesterday. Any particular human trait can be tracked on a pedigree. Okay. So if I'm interested in brown hair, any shape in my pedigree that's shaded in like these two guys, well, I guess one guy, one gal, then those two would have brown hair. Okay. That's what it means by the person has the track trait. If you're shaded in, then you've got whatever that pedigree is interested in. I got to move myself out of the way here. A half filled in circle or square indicates that that particular person carries the trait, but they don't have it. Okay. So if let's say I've got brown eyes, so that would be big B. Remember, brown eyes is dominant, but I also have a blue-eyed trait, a little b, then I would be considered a carrier of blue eyes. Okay. That means I've got the genetic code in me, but it's not being expressed. Okay. So there's actually a lot of people who can carry traits for heart disease, and they'll never get heart disease, but then their children could potentially have heart disease because their parent, where they got their genetics from, they were a carrier of that disease. Okay. So you got to distinguish between affected and carriers. Affected have the particular trait that you're interested in. Carriers are carrying it, but they aren't showing it. Okay, so it's being overshadowed by the dominant trait. Remember, that's possible if you're heterozygous. If you've got one big letter, one small letter, you've still got that DNA in there, or that gene, whatever that small letter is, but you're not showing it because it's being overshadowed by the dominant trait. I'm going to put myself back down here. All right, now when we do pedigrees, the big question is, are we looking at a dominant trait or are we looking at a recessive? And these are some guidelines that you can use to tell if you are actually looking at a dominant or recessive trait. So if neither parent is affected by the trait, then the odds are it is recessive, whatever this particular, let's say it's blue eyes. We'll say blue eyes. So if neither parent has blue eyes, then it's recessive. Okay. If the trait skips generations, then it's also going to be recessive. What does that mean? That means if my mom and dad had brown eyes, but then nobody in my siblings, all my brothers and sisters, if none of us had brown eyes, but then my children would have brown eyes. So the next generation, that would tell us it's recessive. This will make more sense when we actually look at the pedigree here. If at least one parent is affected by the trait, then it is dominant. Okay. What does that mean? That means you can't be a carrier of a dominant trait. If you have the dominant trait, then you've got whatever that trait is, right? You can't mask a dominant trait. It's not going to be hidden because it's dominant. So if at least one parent is affected by the trait, then you've got dominant. If the trait, affects someone in every generation, odds are it is dominant. Okay. Now these are guidelines. There's going to be exceptions to these at times. But in general, if we follow these rules, we can tell if a trait is dominant or recessive. Okay. So if somebody in every generation has the trait, if they're affected by it, that's going to tell you it is dominant. Okay. Let's look at that cystic fibrosis example. Okay. I should probably just leave myself up here. There we go. All right. So the first question I'm going to ask myself is, let's look at generation 1 here. So hopefully you watched the Khan Academy video. I'll do a quick recap here. So your generations are indicated by Roman numerals on the left here. Okay. 1, 2, 3, and then that's Roman numeral for 4. Okay. Individuals are going to be numbered per generation. So if I want to talk about a particular person, got my pen the wrong way here. I would write it like this. Like, let's say I want to talk about this person right here. I would say they are generation 1, and then you put -1. Okay. That's how you indicate what person you're talking about. So then I could do this female right here. She would be generation 3-1. Okay. Or 3-2 if I want to talk about that guy right there. Okay. So that's some basic stuff that I forgot to mention. That's how you indicate which person you're talking about. You've got your generation numbers on the left, and then you've got your person number, I guess, or your individual number down below. So let's talk about generation 1. Think for a second. Are any of these people affected by the trait in generation 1? You've got mom and dad. Are either of them affected? They're not. Okay. They are both what? They're both carriers. So whatever trait this is, we're tracking cystic fibrosis. They both carry the trait, but neither of them are affected by it. Okay. If we go back to our rules, this is a pretty good indicator right away. If neither parent is affected by the trait, it's probably going to be recessive. Okay. Let's go back. Here's their offspring. So you see the line dropping down here. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. Okay. You notice there's something different kind of going on right here. There's individual, let's say it's generation 2, person 6. They did not come from the original parents. Okay. Now that would get you kind of into trouble if these two people were having offspring because they're in the same family. So we don't want that. That's not good. So luckily, that's not happening. We have a new individual showing up here. And you're seeing they're marrying into the family. They get stuck in with the rest of the kids, but they're not from the original parents. Okay. Thank goodness. So in generation two now, look at what we've got. We've got not a carrier, not affected. We've got a carrier. We've got a nothing. We've got has cystic fibrosis. And then we've got a carrier. And then person number 6, this lady that married into the family, she is neither a carrier nor has cystic fibrosis. Okay. So if we go through generation 2 now, how many people actually have cystic fibrosis? The answer is 1. Okay. Just generation 2, person 4 has cystic fibrosis. You've got 2 carriers in there, but they're not going to actually have the ailment, the illness. Okay. So person 2 and person 5 in generation 2, they will not have cystic fibrosis. They're carrying it, but they do not have the disease. So they wouldn't even know. They have no idea that they have, because their parents didn't have it. Okay. So this is where it's kind of spooky. It's like, where did I get this gene from? Because neither of my parents have cystic fibrosis, but there it is. It's recessive, so it's being kind of hidden by the dominant trait here. Okay. Now let's look at what happens in generation 3. So person 5 and 6 get married. They have 3 children themselves, female, male, female, and they've got nobody with cystic fibrosis. Okay. So you had a carrier and then a nothing, a clean, and then they've got no children with cystic fibrosis. So think about it. If cystic fibrosis was dominant, if person 5 in generation 2, this person right here, if they carried the dominant trait, odds are they should have some kids that have it, right? Not only that, they should have it themselves. If you carry a dominant trait, you've got whatever that dominant trait is. So those are 2 indicators right away that this is not a dominant trait. This is recessive. Okay. Now let's look at person 3 and person 4 in generation 3. They are both carriers, and look at what happens to their children. Now they've got 2 out of 3 that have cystic fibrosis, and then they've got 1 that's carrying it but doesn't have it. Okay. So what would this look like in terms of a Punnett square? Well, let's do it, because remember, Punnett squares and pedigrees, they're very related. So let's go ahead and draw it up. Get my old window shape back. And remember, we know that cystic fibrosis is recessive. So let's look at person 3 and 4 right here. If they are both carrying it, that means that we'll call cystic fibrosis C. They've got to be big C, little c, and big C, little c, right? They've got to be carrying it, but not having the disease itself. So let's fill this out. Excuse me. 2 big C's, 2 little c's, 2 big C's, and 2 little. Okay, so we've got, what are our odds here? 1, 2, 3 out of 4 are going to be big C, little c. Okay, so if I was big C, little c, what's that phenotype look like? That means that I do not have cystic fibrosis, but look, you could be a carrier if you've got little c in there. Okay. And then I've got a 1 out of 4 chance that I'm going to get little c, little c. And therefore, I would have cystic fibrosis. So really, if we look at the odds here for this 4th generation, they got 2 out of 3 that have cystic fibrosis. So 2 out of 3 of them ended up with little c, which is kind of bad luck, right? The odds are only 1 in 4. It's a 25% chance. So to have 66% of your children end up with cystic fibrosis, you kind of got unlucky there. So this person here, this female individual number 3, she's going to be, she had a 50% chance of being big C, little c. And so really that one kind of wasn't unlucky. That was expected. You should have a 50-50 shot of having a big C, little c. But to have 2 children with cystic fibrosis, that was kind of unlucky because it's only a 25% chance. Okay. So you see now how pedigrees basically just take Punnett squares and they kind of do it for us. It's an easier way of showing all that, the odds of that later on in future generations without having to do, 500 Punnett squares. Can you imagine do a Punnett square for these guys and then do one for these guys and then do one for them? It'd be a mess. And it wouldn't be very easy to read. So that's why we have pedigrees. They make all this stuff a little bit easier to manage. Sorry, my eraser just Kind of takes forever here. There we go. Okay, so that's the cystic fibrosis one that you looked at. Hopefully that made sense when you did those questions. Most of the people that submitted them had really good answers, but it should only be a 25% chance that they have an offspring with cystic fibrosis, and they got 2 out of 3. So bad luck there. But hopefully you can see now we can determine whether this disease is dominant or recessive based on all of this information. So number one, neither parent is affected. So that indicates to us probably recessive. But also what we didn't mention is, look, it skips generation 3 here. None of these people in generation 3 got cystic fibrosis. You got a carrier, but nobody's got it. So skipping generation 3, that goes down to our second point right here. If traits skip generations, they are recessive. Okay. Now, in your notes that hopefully you have been filling out as we go here, it's going to talk about this one. So I want you to go ahead and give this one a shot and then come back. So pause, give it a shot in your notes, and then come back and finish it, and we'll talk about it because this one's a little bit trickier. I'm going to pull your notes up real quick here and see. Let's see. The question says, sometimes you'll see a pedigree without shaded in shapes to represent carriers. And that's true. A lot of times pedigrees don't bother mentioning the carriers for us, which is kind of annoying, but it's not going to be the end of the world. So because of this, you're going to have to determine genotypes without seeing who carries the trait. So try this practice below. It says, number one, is the trait being tracked dominant or recessive? How do you know? Again, try this before you watch the end of this video. So this is really similar to our cystic fibrosis one, except for the fact that we don't know who the carriers are. But it doesn't really matter because look, right away, nobody in the first generation has whatever this trait is, okay? Whatever's being tracked. But look at their offspring. They've got 1 out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 out of 5 here are not only carriers of the trait, but affected by it, right? We don't know who the carriers are, but we do know this person is affected. So in order for 2 parents who don't have a particular trait or aren't showing a particular trait, in order for them to have an offspring that is showing it, that means that this has got to be recessive, right? Both of these parents up here are heterozygous. So they're, let's say the traits are, I don't know, they're both going to be big R, little r, okay? Because neither of them have whatever this trait is, but their offspring are getting it, okay? So that tells us right away this is probably recessive. Now, is there another indicator here that tells us that this is recessive? There absolutely is. If you haven't seen it yet, I want you to pause again, go back and look and see if you can figure this out. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with generation 3, and generation 4 is kind of an indicator as well. Okay, so hopefully you answered this. Look at generation 3. Nobody at all has it. There's probably some carriers in there. In fact, I know there's some carriers in there. I'll tell you how I know that in a second. But you can see this trait, whatever it is, has skipped a generation. Generation 3 has nobody affected by the trait in it. So right away, that goes along with our first point. It's got to be recessive if it's skipping generations. But what I was saying is I've got a big indicator right here that there are some carriers because 2 out of their 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children right here, 2 out of 5 ended up being affected by this. Okay. So they've got to be carrying it because if any of these 2 people right here are big R, then none of their children should end up with this disease. Okay. So they both have to be carriers. And again, it's going to be just like that Punnett square I did before, big R, or it was big C, little c. It's only a 1 in 4 shot that you should end up with whatever this disease is, but they've got 2 out of 5. So the odds are a little bit better there, but still not great. Yeah, it would be what, 40%? Am I right? Yeah. So they got pretty unlucky there to those 2 people, whatever this trait is. Now, pedigrees don't always track negative things. I think I've been using some negative examples or talking about it like it's negative. You can use a pedigree to track anything. It can be eye color. It could be hair color. It could be baldness. That's one that's tracked often. So pedigrees don't necessarily always have to be about bad things, but they can be very useful. So remember a long time ago, I had you kind of write down all the traits that you had in common with your parents. You can actually make your own pedigree using that idea now, right? If you go back and you look, well, how many people in my family had brown eyes? So if you go back to your grandparents and you can see who must have been carrying a blue-eyed trait and who wasn't, because if you've got two brown-eyed parents, then if anybody that comes from them has blue eyes, you know that they were carrying the blue-eyed trait. If you get what I'm saying. So you can do this on your own if you want. Pedigrees are very useful to track, kind of whatever you're interested in. So those are your two questions for. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more in your notes here. I knew I was mistaken. So number 2 says, if person 3-5 and 3-6 had another offspring, what's the percentage chance that that offspring will be affected by the tracked trait? So if person 3-5 and 3-6, so it's referring to 3-5 is right there, 3-6 is right there. So I guess I kind of already answered that one. Sorry to steal the thunder on it, but it should only be a 25% chance. So their next offspring has a 75% chance of not being affected by this trait. Okay. Remember how we found that out, because they both have to be heterozygous for whatever this track trait is. Okay, so that's going to wrap up pedigrees for today. All I need you to do today is finish those notes, and then you can just share them with me so I can see that you got them done. We're going to go a little bit further with pedigrees tomorrow. There's kind of a whole nother layer to this, and then hopefully I can get to talking about my dog. I mentioned that my dog kind of fits in with this unit because she's got some interesting stuff genetically that's going on with her. So we'll talk about that coming up. Stay tuned, get those notes done, and then share them with me as soon as you guys are done. And I'll talk to you tomorrow. All right. See you then.